Chapter 7. Arvis in Tashbaan. What had really happened was this. When Arvis saw Shasta hurried away by the Narnians, and found herself alone with two horses who, very wisely, wouldn't say a word, she never lost her head, even for a moment. She grabbed Bree's halter and stood still, holding both the horses, and though her heart was beating as hard as a hammer, she did nothing to show it. As soon as the Narnian lords had passed, she tried to move on again, but before she could take a step, another crier, "Bother all these people," thought Arvis, was heard shouting, "Way, way, way! Way for the Tarkina Lasaraleen!" And immediately, following the crier, came 4 armed slaves, and then 2 bears carrying a litter which was all aflutter with silken curtains, and all a-jingle with silver bells, and which scented the whole street with perfumes and flowers. After the litter, female slaves in beautiful clothes, and then a few grooms, runners, pages, and the like. And now Arvis made her first mistake. She knew Lasaraleen quite well, almost as if they'd been in school together, because they'd often stayed in the same houses and been to the same parties. And Arvis couldn't help looking up to see what Lasaraleen looked like now that she was married, and a very great person indeed. It was fatal. The eyes of the 2 girls met, and immediately Lasaraleen sat up in the litter and burst out at the top of her voice, "Arvis! What on earth are you doing here? Your father—" There was not a moment to lose. Without a second's delay, Arvis let go of the horses, caught the edge of the litter, swung herself up beside Lasaraleen, and whispered furiously in her ear, "Shut up! Do you hear? Shut up! You must hide me! Tell your people!" "But darling," began Lasaraleen in the same loud voice. She didn't in the least mind making people stare. In fact, she rather liked it. "Do what I tell you or I'll never speak to you again," hissed Arvis. "Please, please be quick. Lass, it's frightfully important. Tell your people to bring those 2 horses along. Pull all the curtains, the litter, and let us get away somewhere where I can't be found. Please do hurry." "All right, darling," said Lasaraleen in her lazy voice. "Here, 2 of you take the Tarkina's horses," this was to the slaves, "and now home. I say, darling, do you think we really want the curtains drawn on a day like this? I mean to say—" But Arvis had already drawn the curtains, enclosing Lasaraleen and herself in a rich and scented but rather stuffy kind of tent. "I mustn't be seen," she said. "My father doesn't know I'm here. I'm running away." "Oh, my dear, how perfectly thrilling," said Lasaraleen. "I'm dying to hear all about it. Darling, you're sitting on my dress. Do you mind? Oh, that's better. It's a new one. Do you like it? I got it." "Oh, lass, do be serious," said Arvis. "Where's my father?" "Didn't you know?" said Lasaraleen. "He's here, of course. He came to town yesterday and is asking about you everywhere. And to think of you and me being here together and his not knowing anything about it, it's the funniest thing I've ever heard." And she went off in giggles. She always had been a terrible giggler, as Arvis now remembered. "It isn't funny at all," she said. "It's dreadfully serious. Where can you hide me?" "Oh, no difficulty at all, my dear girl," said Lasaraleen. "I'll take you home. My husband's away and no one will see you." "Huh. It's not much fun with these curtains drawn. I want to see people. There's no point in having a new dress if one has to go up, shut up like this." "I hope no one heard you when you shouted out like that," said Arvis. No, of course, darling," said Lasaraleen absent-mindedly. "But you haven't even told me what you think of the dress." "Another thing," said Arvis. "You must tell your people to treat those 2 horses very respectfully. That's part of the secret. They're really talking horses from Narnia." "Fancy!" said Lasaraleen. "How exciting! And oh, darling, have you seen the barbarian queen from Narnia? She's staying in Tashbaan at present. They say Prince Rapidash is madly in love with her. There have been the most wonderful parties and hunts and things all last fortnight. I can't see that she's so pretty myself, but some of the Narnian men are lovely. I was taken out on a river party the day before yesterday, and I was wearing my "How shall we prevent your people telling everyone you've got a visitor?" dressed like a beggar's brat in your house. It might so easily get round to my father. "No, don't keep fussing, there's a dear," said Lasaraleen. "We'll get you some proper clothes in a moment. And here we are." The bears had stopped, and the litter was being lowered. When the curtains were drawn, Arvis found that she was in a courtyard garden very much like the one Shasta had been taken into a few minutes earlier in another part of the city. Lasaraleen would have gone on indoors at once, but Arvis reminded her in a frantic whisper to say something to the slaves about not telling anyone of their mistress's strange visitor. "Sorry, darling, it had gone right out of my head," said Lasaraleen. "Here, all of you. And you, doorkeeper, no one is to be let out of the house today, and anyone I catch talking about this young lady will first be beaten to death, and then be burned alive, and then after that be kept on bread and water for 6 weeks. Now there." Although Lasaraleen had said she was dying to hear Arvis's story, she showed no sign of really wanting to hear it at all. She was, in fact, much better at talking than listening. She insisted on Arvis having a long and luxurious bath. Calamine baths are quite famous. And then dressing her up in the finest of clothes before she would let her explain anything. The fuss she made about choosing the dresses nearly drove Arvis mad. She remembered now that Lasaraleen had always been like that, interested in clothes and party and gossip. Arvis had always been more interested in bows and arrows and horses and dogs and swimming. You will guess that each thought the other quite silly. But when at last they were both seated, and after a meal, it was chiefly of the whipped cream and jelly and fruit and ice sort, in a beautiful pillared room, which Arvis would have liked better if Lasaraleen's spoiled pet monkey hadn't been climbing about it all the time, Lasaraleen at last asked her why she was running away from home. When Arvis had finished telling her story, Lasaraleen said, "But darling, why don't you want to marry a Hosta Tarkan? Everyone's crazy about him. My husband said he's beginning to be one of the greatest men in Calerman. He has just been made Grand Vizier, now old Ixartha has died. Didn't you know?" "I don't care, and I can't stand the sight of him," said Arvis. "Oh, but darling, only think. 3 palaces, and one of them that beautiful one down on the lake by Elkeen. Positively ropes of pearls, I'm told. Baths of ass's milk, and you'd see such a lot of me." "He can keep his pearls and palaces as far as I'm concerned," said Arvis. "You always were a queer girl, Arvis," said Lasaraleen. "What more do you want?" In the end, however, Arvis managed to make her friend believe that she was in earnest, and even to discuss plans. There would be no difficulty now about getting the 2 horses out of the north gate and then on into the tombs. No one would stop or question a groom in fine clothes leading a war horse and a lady's saddle horse down to the river, and Lasaraleen had plenty of grooms to send. It wasn't so easy to decide what to do about Arvis herself. She had suggested she could be carried out in a litter with the curtains drawn, but Lasaraleen told her that litters were only used in the city, and the sight of one going out through the gate would lead to questions for sure. When they had talked for a long time, and it was all the longer because Arvis found it hard to keep her friend to the point, at last Lasaraleen clapped her hands and said, "Oh, I have an idea. There is one way of getting out of the city without using the gates. The Tisrock's garden, may he live forever, runs right down to the water, and there is a little water door. Only for the palace people, of course, but then, you know, dear," here she tittered a little, "we are almost palace people. I say, it is lucky for you that you came to see me. The dear Tisrock, may he live forever, is so kind. We've asked to the palace almost every day, and it's like a second home. I love all the dear princes and princesses, and I positively adore Prince Rabidash. I might run in and see any of the palace ladies at any hour of the day or night. Why shouldn't I slip in with you after dark and let you out by the water door? There are always a few punts and things tied up outside, and even if we were caught, all would be lost," said Arvis. "Oh, darling, don't get so excited," said Lasaraleen. "I was going to say, even if we were caught, everyone would only say it was one of my mad jokes. I'm getting quite well known for them. Only the other day. Do listen, dear. This is frightfully funny. I mean, all would be lost for me, said Arvis a little sharply. Yes, I do see what you mean, darling. Well, can you think of a better plan? Arvis couldn't, and answered, no, we'll have to risk it. When can we start? Oh, not tonight, said Lasaraleen. Of course not tonight. There's a great feast on tonight. I must start getting my hair done for it in a few minutes. And the whole place will be a blaze of lights, and such a crowd, too. It will have to be tomorrow night. Well, this was bad news for Arvis, but she had to make the best of it. The afternoon passed very slowly, and it was a relief when Lasaraleen went out to the banquet. For Arvis was tired of her giggling and her talk about dresses and parties and weddings and engagements and scandals. She went to bed early, and that part she did enjoy. It was so nice to have pillows and sheets again. But the next day passed very slowly. Lasaraleen wanted to go back on the whole arrangement, and kept on telling Arvis that Narnia was a country of perpetual snow and ice, inhabited by demons and sorcerers, and she was mad to think of going there. And with a peasant boy, too, said Lasaraleen. Darling, think of it, it's not nice. Arvis had thought of it a good deal, but she was so tired of Lasaraleen's silliness that by now, for the first time, she began to think that traveling with Shasta was really rather more fun than a fashionable life in Tashbaan. She only replied, you forget that I'll be nobody, just like him, when we get to Narnia. And anyway, I promised. And to think, said Lasaraleen, almost crying, that if you only had sense, you could be wife of the Grand Vizier. Arvis went away to have a private word with the horses. You must go with a groom a little before sunset down to the tombs, she said. No more of those packs. You'll be saddled and bridled again. But there'll have to be food in Hwin's saddlebags and a full water skin behind yours, Bree. The man has orders to let you both have a good long drink at the far side of the bridge. And then Narnia and the North, whispered Bree. But what if Shasta's not at the tombs? Well, wait for him, of course, said Arvis. I hope you've both been quite comfortable. Never been better stabled in my life, said Bree. But if the husband of that tittering Tarkina friend of yours is paying his head groom to get the best oats, I think that head groom has been cheating him. Arvis and Lasaraleen had supper in the pillared room. About 2 hours later, they were ready to start. Arvis was dressed to look like a superior slave girl in a great house, and wore a veil over her face. They had agreed if any questions were asked, Lasaraleen would pretend that Arvis was a slave she was taking as a present to one of the princesses. The two girls went out on foot. A very few minutes brought them to the palace gates. Here there were of course soldiers on guard, but the officer knew Lasaraleen quite well and called his men to attention and saluted. They passed at once into the hall of black marble. A number of courtiers, slaves, and others were still moving about here and there, but this only made the two girls less conspicuous. They passed on into the hall of pillars, and then into the hall of statues, and down the colonnade, passing the great beaten copper doors of the throne room. It was all magnificent beyond description, what they could see of it in the dim light of the lamps. Presently they came out into the garden court, which sloped downhill in a number of terraces. On the far side of that they came to the old palace. It had already grown quite almost dark, and they now found themselves in a maze of corridors lit only by occasional torches fixed to brackets in the walls. Lasaraleen halted at a place where you had to go either to the left or to the right. Go on, do go on, whispered Arvis, whose heart was beating terribly, and who still felt her father might run into them at any corner. I'm just wondering, said Lasaraleen. I'm absolutely not sure which way to go from here. I think it's to the left. Yes, I'm almost quite sure it's to the left. Oh, what fun this is! They took the left-hand way and found themselves in a passage which was hardly lighted at all, and which soon began going down steps. Oh, it's all right, said Lasaraleen. I'm quite sure right now I remember these steps. But at that moment, a moving light appeared ahead. A second later, there appeared from around the distant corner the dark shapes of two men walking backwards and carrying tall candles. And of course, it was only before royalties that people walked backward. Arvis felt Lasaraleen grip her arm, the sort of sudden grip which is almost always a pinch, and which means that the person who is gripping you is very frightened indeed. Arvis thought it odd that Lasaraleen should be so afraid of the Tisroc if he were really such a good friend of hers, but there was no time to go on thinking. Lasaraleen was hurrying her back to the top of the steps on tiptoes and groping wildly against the wall. "Here's the door," she whispered. "Quick!" They went in, drew the door softly behind them, and found themselves in pitch darkness. Arvis could hear by Lasaraleen's breathing that she was terrified. "Tash, preserve us!" whispered Lasaraleen. "What shall we do if he comes in here? Can we hide?" There was a soft carpet under their feet. They groped forward in the room and blundered into a sofa. "Let's lie behind it," whimpered Lasaraleen. "Oh, I do wish we hadn't come." There was just room between the sofa and the curtained wall, and the two girls got down. Lasaraleen managed to get the better position and was completely covered. The upper part of Arvis's face stuck out from behind the sofa, so that if anyone came to the room with a light and happened to look exactly in the right place, they would see her. But of course, because she was wearing a veil, what they saw would not at once look like a forehead and a pair of eyes. Arvis shoved desperately to try to make Lasaraleen give her a little more room, but Lasaraleen, now quite selfish in her panic, fought back and pinched her feet. They gave it up and lay still, panting a little. Their own breath seemed dreadfully noisy, but there was no other noise. "Is it safe?" said Arvis at last in the tiniest possible whisper. I think so," began Lasaraleen. "But my poor nerves." And then came the most terrible noise they could have heard at that moment. The noise of the door opening. And then came light. And because Arvis couldn't get her head any further behind the sofa, she saw everything. First came the two slaves, deaf and dumb as Arvis rightly guessed, and therefore used at the most secret of councils, walking backward and carrying the candles. They took up their stand, one at each end of the sofa. Now this is a good thing, for of course it was now harder for anyone to see Arvis once a slave was in front of her and she was looking between his heels. Then came an old man, very fat, wearing a curious pointed cap, by which she immediately knew he was the Tisroc. The least of the jewels with which he was covered was worth more than all the clothes and weapons of the Narnian lords put together. But he was so fat, and such a mass of frills and pleats and baubles and buttons and tassels and talismans, that Arvis couldn't help thinking the Narnian fashions, at any rate for the men, looked much nicer. After him came a tall young man with a feathered and jeweled turban on his head, and an ivory-sheathed scimitar at his side. He seemed very excited, and his eyes and teeth flashed fiercely in the candlelight. Last of all came a little hump-backed, wizened old man, whom she recognized with a shudder, the new Grand Vizier and her own betrothed husband, Ahosta Tarkin himself. As soon as all three had entered the room and the door was shut, the Tisroc seated himself on the divan with a sigh of contentment. The young man took his place standing before him, and the Grand Vizier got down on his knees and elbows, laid his face flat on the carpet. And that's the end of chapter 7. Well, at first it sounded like Arvis was going to have the easier time between the two, making it to the tombs, being rescued as she was by her somewhat silly friend, but boy, talk about out of the frying pan and into the fire. We thought Shasta was in a tight spot, but now Arvis, cornered and trapped in a room, even still slightly visible, with all of the people she desperately wants to be as far away from as possible, right there in front of her. This is a sticky, sticky spot. I hope Arvis keeps that cool head, and I hope her silly friend, Lasaraleen, can keep her mouth shut.